To our continuing coverage of the latest coming in from Afghanistan, I'm Molly Gambhir and I'm piecing together the developments that have panned out over the last few hours. It's been a dramatic Sunday as the way things have unfolded in Afghanistan. The worst fears seem to be coming true with the Taliban earlier in the day inching closer towards Kabul. In the latest, it has emerged that Ashraf Ghani, the president of Afghanistan, has left Afghanistan for Tajikistan. The vice president, Amrullah Saleh, has also left the country. Abdullah Abdullah, in a very crucial development, has referred to Ashraf Ghani as the former president of Afghanistan. That is a huge indication of where things lie at this point. For the people of Afghanistan, a lot of uncertainty on the horizon, their fate continuing to hang in the balance. Joining us for more on these developments is Glenn Carl, former intelligence officer and American writer. Thanks very much, Glenn, for speaking with us. As Afghanistan once again stands at this crucial juncture, your assessment of where the security situation lies at this point?
Oh gosh, well, I'm far away in time and space, so it's hard to have special insights, but this overall strategic picture, unfortunately, I think conforms to Afghan's history, meaning that the Taliban are fundamentally a Pashtun phenomenon. They've had the support of ISI for decades, and Pakistan is there. And the United States is on the other side of the world. And so when the U.S. leaves, the situation is reverting to its historic norm with a weak Afghanistan, with a Pashtun Taliban faction or group that is the most powerful of the competing factions there.
At this point, how embarrassing would you say this situation is for the United States, given that a lot of the blame has been coming their way for where things are at this point, while they maintain that their mission was successful?
Well, it's a tragic situation, first for the Afghan people, certainly, and it is ultimately a failure of U.S. objectives, but U.S. objectives were for many years, or still are, murky. Our initial objective was to destroy Al-Qaeda, and incidentally, in fact, the Taliban, who were hosting them. And then the policy was explicitly to avoid nation building, whether that was wise or not. That was what happened. And then we diverted resources to Iraq, which was clearly unwise. And then we were in this stasis where to leave would be a failure and to invest in the country would be counter to what we imagined we were doing. And then we became nation builders. So ultimately a failure, yes, but the specific collapse and events have to be on the Afghan government and its failures. One can provide tools, but one has to rely on the indigenous groups to have the will to defend themselves.
Glenn, to what extent, if at all, are you surprised by the pace at which the Taliban have made those territorial gains and the rapidly changing situation on the ground?
I don't think that what's happening now is, in the broadest sense, a surprise to most of the Americans. However, the speed that it's happened certainly surprised me, although I'm far now from firsthand involvement, of course. But I do think that the Pentagon was and then the intelligence community, I guess, caught by surprise at the speed, but not the ultimate direction and result.
Glenn, as we've been piecing together the latest that's been coming in, the way things stand at this point, Ashraf Ghani has left Afghanistan. As we understand, he's left for Tajikistan. Even the Vice President, Amrullah Saleh, has left Afghanistan. All along, the Taliban had said over the last few hours that they want a peaceful transfer of Kabul and that they will not be taking over Kabul by force. In terms of the way they have, portrayed their capturing of Kabul, are you also surprised at all by the way in which this was done in terms of no force being used?
Well, it's in their interest to have as few Taliban fighters die as possible. So this is astute on their part, and if you can achieve what you wish without using violence and suffering pain and harm, then that's smart. The Taliban have always been more than clever, but deeply committed and talented fighters. Now, it is easier to destroy than to maintain or to build. So insurgents in that sense always have a bit of an advantage. To break things is simple. So far, they have, the last couple of weeks, they've shown some wisdom.
All right, we're losing that audio line with Glenn. We'll just try and reestablish that link. As Glenn is telling us the broader sense of where things stand at this point, a lot of surprise that has been expressed by the experts who we've been speaking to as well through the day when it comes to the pace at which things have unfolded on the ground, that the Taliban have inched closer to Kabul comes as no shocker, but the speed at which they've made these territorial gains on the ground continues to surprise many experts, as Glenn is also telling us. In the latest, as Ashraf Ghani has left for Tajikistan from Afghanistan, that's a huge indication of where things stand at this point. Going back across to Glenn Carl, who's been sharing his perspectives and what he makes of the situation. Back to you, Glenn. We lost you there for a bit. Go ahead with the point that you were making.
Sure. I'm sorry about that, though we are all far away from each other. I think frequently of a conversation I had at this point more than 15 years ago with an Indian intelligence officer. And he and I were discussing what would happen in Afghanistan and what the U.S. was up to. And he asked me my assessment. And I said, well, at some point, the United States will return to its home, but Pakistan will always remain the neighbor of Afghanistan. And that gives the Taliban, therefore, who is a creature initially of the ISI, a tremendous advantage. And my Indian colleague thought that was, he agreed with that. So to repeat, the strategic direction is not a surprise, I think. Now, the last 6 weeks have surprised me, and I'm, as we hear, have surprised other Americans and international observers. But tactical things are always hard to assess with perfect accuracy.
Right. Glenn, let's also talk about what the Taliban being in Kabul would mean not just for the people of Afghanistan, but the impact that this takeover will have on the entire region.
Yeah, well, this is from the Indian and American perspective is probably the critical question. You know, for the Afghan people, from I suspect your perspective, your viewers' perspective, and mine, this is awful. This is terrible. There's nothing good that I can see coming from this, in particular for the 50% of Afghans who are female. From a international perspective for the United States, here I think my perspective will differ from the conventional one a little bit. The conventional view is that this is a catastrophe for the U.S. and the U.S. has lost face and the U.S. may lose influence internationally. I don't agree with that. Regional issues are regional, and unless there is an active series of operations taken by Al-Qaeda and Al-Qaeda-like terrorists from Afghanistan, then strategically I don't see this affecting U.S. national interests in various parts of the world or the U.S. influence and interactions with other countries. Regionally, what we'll see, it's of concern, I would say, for everyone, because the ISI's strategic objectives are being achieved. Pakistan has always sought a weak Afghanistan with heavy influence of the dominant faction, which in this case is the Pashtun, and that seems to be what's happening. Will that affect Kashmir and Pakistani-Indian relations? I'm not completely certain of that, actually. The Pakistanis and the ISI have not needed Afghanistan to train, harbor, fund, direct, cajole, and cite, and so on, terrorists when they view it in their interest to do so, most of the time unwisely. But that has been what the Pakistanis have done. So I think that will continue, probably unchanged from prior to the fall of Kabul now. But no one should be happy that you have a retrograde social political movement now taking power.
A lot of parallels have been drawn with what happened in Vietnam. What do you make of that comparison?
Well, I did have that. Of course, this is what obviously comes to mind, seeing images of helicopters being the iconic ones as the capital falls of a U.S.-supported state. But there, the lesson, I think, is important. And Vietnam was a catastrophe and a series of poor decisions by the United States. However, the fear prior to the fall of Saigon and at the time was, oh, the U.S. has lost face, the U.S. will lose influence, allies can't count on the United States. None of this actually proved to be the case. Similarly, the United States was involved with, sent troops to Lebanon in the early 80s and then had our embassy and our barracks blown up, and President Reagan withdrew our troops. And the fear was, oh, well, this is going to be terrible. Reagan essentially declared victory and defeat and then left. And the strategic consequences for the U.S.'s objectives in the region and internationally were minor. It actually ultimately is wise not to put bad money after good, the expression from economics. And so I don't think that this will have a lasting dramatic effect on U.S. and international relations strategically. But I'm not minimizing that this is a terrible event.
Indeed. Glenn, some of the experts we've been speaking to over the last few days have talked about how the Taliban have not changed their stripes, and they've expressed concern about what lies ahead for the women and children of Afghanistan. Do you fear a repeat of what happened the last time around?
I do. There's nothing good and only bad things to say about what's going to happen. I mean, fundamental for me and for billions of people is that the individual, be he male or she female, or a Muslim or a Christian or a Hindu or anything else, the individual should be the center of the state's responsibility to let the individual live as he or she aspires to live. And that is not likely to be the case in a antiquated version of Islam. And so this is a terrible thing. There's nothing good to say, only bad things to say, tragic developments for the Afghan people that I can see.
And how can we not talk about the role of Pakistan so far, and your assessment of Pakistan's role from here onwards?
Oh, it's a triumph for Pakistan. At least it's a triumph for the ISI. As I've said, there's been no question for decades that the Taliban were fundamentally the creature of the ISI. I have spoken with counterparts of mine from ISI, and I said, and I'm hardly the only one to say this, I said, you're creating a Frankenstein. And remember what happened to Dr. Frankenstein. Frankenstein killed his creator. And the Taliban have already created tremendous problems for the Pakistanis themselves. But the Pakistanis, at least the ISI, have always sought to have this imagined strategic depth in Afghanistan, which I find to be a very dubious concept, but drives much of Pakistani policy. And they want to have a faction, which is understandable, that they control or at least influence preponderantly in Afghanistan. And they have achieved that now. Whether it will bring positive developments to Pakistan, I find highly doubtful. But a state always wants to have control of its neighbors rather than to fear what will happen and not know. And so in that sense, the Pakistanis have achieved their objectives.
Right. Glenn, given where things stand at this point and how this has been described as a failure of the U.S. administration, one cannot help but talk about how things could have been handled differently by the United States. Would you like to weigh in on that?
Well, gosh, where to start with errors? I personally don't think, I think it was the right decision in 2001 to go after al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. And the Taliban had always been more than two-faced, and I worked on that issue for years prior to 9/11 concerning Afghanistan and the Taliban. However, that is one objective. The second one was, well, what happens then? And the Republican Bush administration was clear that it didn't intend to engage in nation building. One can debate whether that's wise or not, but that was the position. What I think is generally regarded as a strategic error of huge proportions was that immediately after invading Afghanistan, even prior to invading Afghanistan, the United States was already diverting most of its resources to Iraq, which was truly a fool's errand. And that left Afghanistan as the orphan. And so we were there with no particular objective other than to stop al-Qaeda, which largely was in Pakistan at that point, not in Afghanistan anymore. And then we just sort of sat there. And so that is fundamentally the error. Now, would another decade of nation building have made a strategic difference? That's very doubtful. However many resources you have, and however powerful a military or a diplomatic organization is, to change an entire society of 30 million people is probably beyond the ability of any state at any time. And that was ultimately the challenge, and now we're seeing the failure.
Let's also talk about the statement that's been put out by the Russian Foreign Ministry, saying that amid the Taliban's inching closer towards Kabul and the takeover of Afghanistan, an emergency session of the UN Security Council is being planned, and Russia will not be evacuating its embassy in Kabul as of now. To what extent are you optimistic about any intervention at all on part of the international community now, on part of the United Nations, if this special emergency session does get underway?
I don't have much optimism. Gosh, anything the Russians say or do, of course, one should take not at much value. They will reflexively and strategically, consistently act so as to harm the United States. That seems to be the leitmotif of Russian policy, as well as to advance their own interests, which is understandable. The UN will it does have ability to provide humanitarian relief in any number of instances. That is possible. The Taliban are likely to welcome international aid if it comes on their terms. Beyond that, and even of that, I'm skeptical, because the Taliban are likely to be wary of kafir, godless international humanitarian civil servants. Beyond that, I don't hold out a lot of optimism or expectation that the international community will be able to do much of anything. I would be surprised if circumstances reverted to the utter catastrophe of that existed prior to the American involvement and when the Taliban were in power. I expect that their leadership is more sophisticated now than they were 20 years ago. But international help, one can hope, but I am not optimistic.
Appreciate very much you joining us on the broadcast as Afghanistan stands at this crucial juncture and for sharing those perspectives. Anas Malik, our correspondent, has been on the ground in Kabul. He is now joining us live on the broadcast. Anas, over to you. What is the latest that you have at this point?
Well, the latest is that I can still hear choppers hovering over. They're back at it in the skies of Kabul. The Taliban have ordered their men to enter the city of Kabul, and in a while from now we'd probably be seeing them running over checkposts of the city. The Taliban fighters, or the men from the Taliban, would be undertaking operations, administrative operations of the city, because they say in their statement that the Taliban have had reports that the Kabul police has abandoned their checkposts. So therefore, in order to avoid any unrest, they have ordered their men to enter the capital city of Kabul. So in a while from now, we'd be seeing them parading on the streets of Kabul. Additionally, with President Ashraf Ghani leaving for Tajikistan, we're seeing flight cancellations, and starting from the UAE, which has said that from Monday it would not be flying to Kabul. I've learned from my sources that the Turkish Airlines has cancelled its flight to Kabul as well. That's because there are only four international carrier operators that fly in or out of Kabul. So the options are pretty limited. As we speak, there is calm within the city now. The chaos, the unrest, that anxiety, that panic mode that we witnessed throughout the day, that's not there. There's relatively calm. I can hear that around me. I can hear choppers hovering over at a far distance, but the city will be waking up to a new day tomorrow, to an entirely new day tomorrow, which where when the people get out on the city, they would not be meeting random policemen, those who they used to every day at a specific checkpoint, but instead they're likely to encounter Taliban members, or Talibs as they say it, and that it would be very interesting to see how the Taliban would be treating the common people of Afghanistan. Molly?
Right, a lot of uncertainty, unfortunately, lies ahead for the people of Afghanistan, not just for them, for the people of the entire region. We're leaving it there for the moment. Anas Malik getting us those updates from Kabul. Thanks very much. With that, we're taking a very short break, but that remains our continuing focus right here on WION World is One. WION now available in your country. Download the app now. Get all the news on the move.